Sarah sat in her cozy apartment looking out the window at the busy streets below. It was a calm day, the kind of day where everything felt still, except for the noise in her head. As the sun began to set, the reflection on the glass made her feel trapped in time, as if nothing was moving forward. Her life had changed so much in the past few years, and yet she still found herself stuck in the same place, haunted by her past. It had been 2 years since her divorce from David, her ex-husband, and although she had done her best to move on, some wounds were harder to heal than others. They had been married for 6 years, and during that time she had believed in the idea of forever. But forever wasn't what it seemed. In the end, their marriage had crumbled under the weight of misunderstandings, resentment, and too many silent nights where no one knew how to fix the growing distance between them. But there was one good thing that came out of their marriage: their beautiful daughter, Emily. At only 3 years old, Emily was the light of Sarah's life, the reason she got up every day, the reason she fought to keep going. Despite the pain of the divorce, Sarah knew she had to stay strong for Emily. That's when the invitation arrived. It was from David's family. They were hosting Emily's baptism at the local church, and the invitation addressed Sarah as Emily's mother. On the surface, it seemed like a gesture of goodwill, a way to include Sarah in her daughter's special day. But Sarah knew better. This wasn't just any invitation. This was a test of whether Sarah was truly accepted back into the fold of David's family, or if they would continue to exclude her from their lives. Ever since the divorce, things had been tense between Sarah and David's side of the family. They had always been close-knit, and Sarah had never really felt like she fully belonged. As soon as she and David separated, the divide grew wider. His family, especially his mother, Margaret, made it clear that Sarah was no longer part of their world. It hurt Sarah more than she liked to admit, not just because she lost her marriage, but because she also lost the people she thought of as family. Margaret, in particular, had been like a second mother to Sarah during their marriage, but that relationship was shattered the moment David and Sarah separated. Still, for the sake of Emily, Sarah tried to keep things civil. She never stopped reaching out, trying to show that she wanted her daughter to have a relationship with her grandparents and extended family. But each attempt felt like pushing a rock up a hill. No matter what she did, David's family didn't seem to want her there. And now, with the baptism approaching, Sarah wasn't sure if it was worth the emotional toll to even try. But Emily's baptism was important. It was a milestone. Sarah couldn't bear the thought of missing it, even if it meant enduring another painful encounter with people who had made it clear that they didn't want her around. The day of the baptism arrived, and Sarah dressed Emily in a small, white dress that she had picked out herself. Emily looked so innocent, so pure, as she twirled in front of the mirror, completely unaware of the tension that hung in the air. Sarah smiled at her daughter, a bittersweet smile, as she adjusted the little girl's dress. For a moment, she forgot about the drama, about the hurt. She was just a mother ready to see her daughter take part in a sacred moment. They arrived at the church early, hoping to avoid the chaos. Sarah held Emily's hand tightly as they walked through the doors. She took a deep breath, her heart racing as she scanned the room for familiar faces. There were a few of David's relatives scattered about, chatting with each other, and at the front of the room stood David's parents, Margaret and Thomas, already in place. Sarah's stomach twisted as her eyes met Margaret's for a brief second. The coldness in Margaret's gaze sent a chill through Sarah's body, but she quickly brushed it aside. Emily was excited, pulling on her mother's hand and pointing toward the altar, eager to see what would happen next. Sarah bent down to adjust her daughter's tiny shoes, but just as she did, Margaret walked over to her. Sarah stood up slowly, trying to keep her composure. "Sarah," Margaret said, her voice tight, "I don't think it's appropriate for you to be here today." Sarah's heart dropped. "What do you mean? This is my daughter's baptism. I'm her mother. I have every right to be here." Margaret's face was stern, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "It's just not the right time. The family doesn't want any unnecessary drama. You've already caused enough tension between us." She glanced toward the rest of the family, who were now staring at Sarah, waiting for her to leave. Sarah felt a knot form in her throat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Unnecessary drama," she repeated, her voice trembling. "I've done nothing but try to keep the peace. I've been here for Emily, but you've never made me feel welcome." Margaret's gaze hardened. "You don't belong here, Sarah, not today. It's better for everyone if you just leave." Sarah's chest tightened, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. She looked down at Emily, who was pulling on her hand again, oblivious to the argument happening around her. Sarah could feel the weight of the situation, the humiliation, the hurt, the betrayal. Her own daughter was caught in the middle, and Sarah was being forced out of an event that should have been a moment of joy. Her mind raced. What was she supposed to do? Should she just leave and let them have their way? Should she fight? Was it worth the pain of continuing to push against a wall that would never move? Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she turned to leave. She couldn't stay. Not now. Not like this. She walked out of the church, her heart pounding in her chest, her daughter's innocent face still full of joy as they left the sacred ceremony behind. She could hear the muffled sounds of the ceremony from outside, but all she felt was emptiness. Standing on the steps of the church, Sarah wiped her tears away and took a deep breath. She promised herself that she would never let them see her broken. But as she walked away from the church, a part of her died inside. She couldn't believe how far things had gone, how she had been treated, how the family she once knew had pushed her aside. All for what? To keep their perfect image intact? To exclude her from the life of the daughter they all claimed to love? As Sarah walked away, she knew this wasn't the end. She would not let them push her out of Emily's life. But how? She didn't know yet. All she knew was that she would not give up on her daughter. She couldn't. Sarah walked slowly down the sidewalk, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just happened. She could still hear the muffled voices from inside the church, the laughter, the joy, as if it was all happening in another world, a world that didn't include her. Her thoughts were swirling, each one more painful than the last. How had things gotten this bad? It had been years since Sarah had been close to David's family. She had always felt like an outsider, even when they were married. They were a tight-knit group, and although they never outright rejected her, Sarah always felt like she was being judged, measured by some invisible standard that she could never quite meet. After all, David came from a wealthy, well-established family, and Sarah was just a regular woman trying to carve out her own life. She had worked hard to fit in, to make their family gatherings easier, but it had never worked. They didn't seem to accept her, no matter how hard she tried. When Sarah and David separated, it was as if she had become invisible to them. The phone calls stopped coming. The invitations to family gatherings disappeared. David's family had closed ranks, and Sarah was left standing on the outside. She wasn't even sure if David had spoken up for her, or if he simply let it happen. Either way, the silence was deafening. It was clear to Sarah that they all had made their decision, and it was as if her role as Emily's mother didn't matter. But the worst part was that Emily felt it too. Every time she asked about her grandparents or cousins, Sarah had to struggle to find the right words to explain. She didn't want to poison Emily's mind with the hurt and disappointment she felt, but it was hard not to. It was even harder knowing that Emily would eventually understand why her mother wasn't welcome in the family's life. Sarah couldn't shake the image of her daughter's innocent face, her little hands clinging to Sarah's as they walked, away from the baptism. Emily had been so excited, so full of joy, and Sarah had ruined that. It didn't matter that she had been pushed out. It didn't matter that she had been treated unfairly. What mattered was that her daughter had been caught in the middle of all this pain. The thought of Emily's confusion gnawed at Sarah, making her feel like a failure. She wanted to give Emily the life she deserved, a life full of love, support, and family. But how could she do that when the people who were supposed to love her were the ones pushing her away? That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Sarah sat in her living room, the lights dimmed, her mind spinning. It felt like the world was closing in on her, She thought about what had happened earlier that day, about Margaret's cold words, about how easily they had pushed her aside. Her heart felt like a stone in her chest. She wanted to be angry. She wanted to scream and shout and demand justice. She had every right to, but something inside her kept her from doing it. Maybe it was because she knew that fighting them wouldn't change anything. Or maybe it was because deep down she was scared. Scared of losing Emily. Scared of the world that seemed to be closing in around her. It wasn't just David's family that had shut her out. It was the whole idea of the perfect family, the one that seemed to have it all together, the one she could never quite belong to. Sarah stood up and walked over to the window, staring out at the street below. It was a cool evening, the sky darkening, with the setting sun, and she felt like she was standing at a crossroads. She could let this defeat her. She could give up, walk away, and tell herself that she didn't need these people in her life. Or she could fight. She could find a way to stand her ground, to make sure that her daughter would always know how much she was loved, even if the rest of the world didn't see it. That thought gave her some strength, a small flicker of hope in an otherwise dark moment. She wasn't going to give up on Emily. Not now, not ever. But she also knew that she couldn't keep trying to fight this battle on her own. She needed help. She needed someone to understand. The next day, Sarah decided to take a walk, to clear her mind. She had no destination in mind, but the fresh air always helped her think. As she strolled through the park, she noticed a cafe she hadn't seen before, tucked away on a quiet corner. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee drew her in, and she decided to stop for a while. It was nice to take a break from everything. Nice to be in a place where no one knew her story and she could just be. As Sarah walked inside, she noticed it wasn't crowded, just a few people scattered around the cozy space. She ordered a cup of tea and found a corner to sit in. She wasn't in the mood for company, but she was hoping the quiet would help her gather her thoughts. She was about to take a sip of her tea when a voice interrupted her. "Mind if I join you?" Startled, Sarah looked up. A man stood there holding a coffee cup, his casual yet confident demeanor making him stand out in the quiet cafe. His eyes were warm, and there was a kindness to his smile. Sarah hesitated for a moment, not sure if she was in the mood for a conversation with a stranger. But something about the man made her feel at ease, so she nodded. "Sure," she said quietly. The man sat down across from her, taking a sip of his coffee before speaking again. "I couldn't help but overhear. You sounded a bit upset earlier. Everything okay?" Sarah blinked, surprised. She hadn't thought she'd been talking out loud, but then again she had been so lost in her thoughts that it didn't seem all that unlikely. She considered telling him to mind his own business, but something in his eyes made her feel like he genuinely wanted to listen. "I'm not sure," Sarah said, her voice hesitant. "It's just family stuff. You wouldn't understand." The man raised an eyebrow, leaning forward slightly. "Try me," he said gently. "I've heard a lot of stories. Maybe I can help." For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt like someone cared. She didn't know why, but she felt like she could talk to him. And so she did. She told him about the baptism, about how David's family had treated her, and about the deep pain she felt as a mother, unable to protect her daughter from the harshness of their actions. As she spoke, she noticed the man's expression softening. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix anything, he just listened. And for that, Sarah was grateful. When she finished, there was a long silence between them. "I'm sorry you're going through this," he said finally, his voice calm. "Family can be complicated, but I believe that sometimes people need a little help to see the bigger picture. You deserve respect, and your daughter deserves to have both of her parents in her life without all the drama." Sarah looked up at him, a little surprised by how sincere his words felt. "I've tried," she said softly, "but I'm not sure what to do anymore." The man took another sip of his coffee before setting it down. "Maybe you need someone to stand with you," he said simply, "someone who isn't afraid to speak up." For a moment, Sarah didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to people offering to help in such an unexpected way, but she knew that in this moment, she had found someone who understood her pain, and maybe, just maybe, someone who could help her get through this. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to hope. Over the next few days, Sarah couldn't shake the conversation she had had with the stranger at the cafe. She found herself thinking about it at odd moments, as if his words had planted a seed in her mind that refused to stop growing. Maybe, you need someone to stand with you. Those words echoed in her mind over and over. It wasn't just the support she had been craving. It was the realization that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face everything alone anymore. His name was Richard, and he seemed like a man who had seen a lot of life. Someone who had a quiet confidence about him, not the kind of person who looked down on others but who understood what it meant to stand up for what was right. After their brief conversation at the cafe, Richard had left with a simple, "Take care of yourself." But before he left, he gave Sarah his business card, insisting that if she ever needed anything, she could reach out to him. At first, Sarah thought about tossing the card away. She had enough on her plate and didn't need any more complications in her life. But as the days went on, she found herself looking at the card more often, wondering if she was making a mistake by dismissing the one person who had shown genuine kindness in a long time. It wasn't like she had many people she could turn to for advice. Her friends had their own lives, and David's family had made it clear they didn't want her around. So, what was the harm in reaching out? One evening, after tucking Emily into bed, Sarah sat down at her kitchen table, the business card lying in front of her. She stared at it for a few moments before picking up her phone. With a deep breath, she dialed the number on the card. Her heart raced as she waited for Richard to pick up. "Hello?" His voice was calm and warm, just like she remembered. "Hi, Richard," Sarah said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's Sarah from the cafe. I'm not sure if you remember me, but I was wondering if we could talk." "I remember you," Richard said without hesitation. "I'm glad you called. What's on your mind?" Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I don't really know where to start, but I'm in a situation with my daughter's father's family. It's been really hard, and I don't know what to do anymore. I could use some advice, I guess." Richard paused for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was understanding. "I'm happy to listen, Sarah. Sometimes it helps just to talk about it." And so Sarah told him everything. She told him about the baptism, about being excluded, about the pain of being pushed out of her daughter's life by the very people who should have been welcoming her in. She shared her frustrations and fears, how she felt like she was losing Emily to a family that didn't value her role as a mother. As she spoke, she could feel the weight lifting off her shoulders. It was the first time in weeks she felt like someone truly understood. Richard didn't interrupt. He just listened, his calm presence through the phone comforting her more than she expected. When she finished, he let the silence hang for a moment, then spoke. "You've been through a lot, Sarah, and I can tell how much you care about your daughter. You're not alone in this," he said. "Sometimes when we feel the most helpless, that's when we need to take a stand, not just for ourselves, but for the people we love. I believe you can make things better for Emily. But it's going to take some courage." Sarah's eyes welled up with tears as Richard's words settled in her heart. She had been so focused on everything she had lost, on the hurt, on the rejection, that she hadn't stopped to think about the strength she had within herself. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Emily, for her daughter's future, for the family she wanted to create despite all the odds. "Courage," Sarah whispered to herself, feeling a spark of hope flicker inside her. "Exactly," Richard said. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I can help. If you want, I can come with you the next time there's a family event. I know it might feel awkward, but sometimes having someone with you can make a big difference." Sarah felt a mix of relief and apprehension. She had been so used to handling things on her own that the thought of someone standing by her side, especially someone like Richard, who didn't even know her that well, felt strange. But at the same time, it felt right. Maybe this was the support she had been missing. "I don't know," Sarah began, unsure of what to say next. "I don't even know if they'll let me back in. I've tried so hard to be part of Emily's life, but they just keep pushing me away. I get it, Richard said. But sometimes when we stand up for what's right, others start to see things differently. You don't have to fight them alone. I'm willing to be there with you if you want. Sarah thought about it for a moment. The idea of Richard being there, supporting her, gave her the courage to imagine a different outcome. One where she didn't have to feel like an outsider in her own daughter's life. Maybe it was time to stop allowing David's family to call the shots, to stop letting them dictate how much of a role she could have in Emily's life. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to take control of her own story. I think I want you to come, Sarah said, her voice more confident than it had been in days. I want Emily to have her family, but I need to make sure that I'm part of that too. Richard chuckled softly. I'm glad to hear that. I'll be there whenever you need me, and I'll help you figure out a plan to make sure your daughter knows how much you love her no matter what. Over the next few days, Sarah and Richard kept in touch. They talked about strategies, about how Sarah could assert herself without causing more tension, about how to approach the next family gathering with a sense of calm and confidence. Sarah had always been a determined person, but this was different. This time she had someone in her corner, someone who believed in her even when she hadn't fully believed in herself. The day of the next family gathering arrived, and Sarah felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. This was her chance to prove that she wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let David's family dictate her role in her daughter's life anymore. She had a right to be there, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that away from her. Richard met her at her apartment before the event, offering a few words of encouragement. You're doing the right thing, Sarah. Remember, you're not fighting alone anymore. Sarah smiled, feeling a little less nervous than before. She wasn't sure what would happen at the event, but she knew one thing for sure. She was ready to face whatever came her way. With Richard's support, she felt stronger than she ever had before. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she had a chance at making things right, for herself, for Emily, and for the family she still longed to have. The day of the family gathering arrived faster than Sarah had expected. It was the kind of day that made her stomach churn with nervous energy, yet at the same time, a spark of determination was slowly burning inside her. She had never imagined she'd be in this position, trying to reclaim her place in Emily's life while facing the cold resistance from David's family. But today was different. Today, she was going to take control of her own story, no longer hiding in the shadows of their expectations. As Sarah got ready, she couldn't help but notice the subtle shift in herself. She had always prided herself on being strong and independent, but over the past few weeks, especially after her conversation with Richard, she had begun to see herself differently. She wasn't just a mother standing alone anymore. She was a mother who knew her worth, who understood that she deserved to be a part of her daughter's life, no matter what anyone else thought. Mom, are we going to see Grandma and Grandpa today? Emily's sweet voice brought Sarah out of her thoughts. She turned to find her daughter dressed in a cute little dress, her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She looked so much like David when she smiled, and Sarah's heart swelled with love. Yes, sweetie, Sarah said softly, kneeling down to her level. We're going to see them today, and I'll be right there with you. I'm so proud of you. Emily beamed, clearly excited to see her grandparents. Sarah forced a smile, though her heart ached at the thought of how the day might unfold. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. As she fixed Emily's coat and brushed a strand of hair from her face, Sarah whispered a silent promise to herself. She wouldn't back down. She had fought for too long, and now it was time to stand her ground. They arrived at David's family home a little earlier than expected, giving Sarah a few moments to compose herself before walking inside. Richard had offered to join her, but Sarah had insisted she could do this on her own. She appreciated his support more than he knew, but she had to prove to herself that she could handle this, even if it was uncomfortable. After all, this was her daughter's family, and she had every right to be there. The moment they stepped through the door, Sarah could feel the tension in the air. David's family, who were gathered in the living room, stopped their conversation abruptly when they saw her. Margaret, David's mother, was the first to speak, her eyes narrowing as she gave Sarah a cold stare. "You're here," she said, her voice icy. It wasn't a greeting, it wasn't even an acknowledgement of her presence. It was more like a statement, as though Sarah had just broken some unspoken rule. Sarah took a deep breath, holding her head. "Hi. I'm here for Emily," she said, her voice steady, but with an underlying firmness. "I'm not here for anyone else's approval." The room fell silent. The uncomfortable air around her made Sarah feel like an intruder, like she didn't belong in this space that had once been so familiar, but she refused to let it show. She glanced around at the family members who were staring at her, some of them with a mix of curiosity and confusion. Sarah knew they were waiting for her to shrink back, to retreat the way she always had in the EO. Past, but not today. David entered the room just then, his expression unreadable. He looked at Sarah for a long moment as if he was trying to figure out what to say. Finally, he spoke. "Sarah," he said slowly, his voice tense. "What are you doing here?" "I'm here because Emily is my daughter," Sarah replied calmly. "And I have just as much right to be part of her life as you or anyone else in this room." David hesitated, clearly caught off guard by Sarah's calm yet unwavering response. For a brief moment, Sarah saw a flicker of guilt cross his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. He looked at his mother, then back at Sarah. "You know this isn't easy for anyone," David said, his voice softer now. "We're just trying to keep things peaceful." "I don't want peace at the cost of my relationship with my daughter," Sarah said, her words cutting through the tension in the room. "I've always tried to be respectful, but this..." She gestured around at the awkward silence. "This isn't peace. This is you all ignoring my place in Emily's life." The words hung in the air, and for the first time, Sarah noticed a shift in the room. Margaret, who had been the loudest voice against Sarah's presence, looked momentarily stunned. Sarah had never spoken to her like this before, and perhaps for the first time Margaret realized that Sarah wasn't going to bow to the pressure. David, too, seemed uncertain now. His posture softened, and for a moment, Sarah thought he might actually say something supportive. But just as quickly, the old walls went back up and he returned to his familiar role as a mediator, someone trying to keep everyone happy, even if it meant making Sarah feel like an outsider. "You have every right to be here," David said, reluctantly. "But you know it's not easy for everyone, especially for Mom." Sarah looked directly at Margaret, whose cold expression hadn't wavered. "I understand that, Margaret," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I'm not here to fight with you. I'm here for Emily. She deserves to have her mother in her life, and I'm not asking for permission anymore." Margaret didn't respond immediately, but the tension between them seemed to soften, even if just a little. The other family members were still quiet, unsure of what to make of the situation. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. As the evening progressed, Sarah stayed close to Emily, making sure her daughter felt safe and loved. Every now and then, David's family members would approach her, trying to make small talk or offer polite smiles, but the conversations always felt forced. Sarah was used to it by now. It was clear that despite what they said, they weren't quite ready to accept her back into their world. But that was fine. She wasn't there to win their approval. She was there for Emily. Richard's words echoed in Sarah's mind. "You don't have to fight alone anymore." She realized that Richard's support had made a world of difference. His belief in her gave her the strength to stand tall, even when things felt uncomfortable or uncertain. At the end of the night, as Sarah was preparing to leave with Emily, Margaret came over to her. The older woman's face was softer now, and there was a hint of something that resembled regret in her eyes. I didn't mean to make things harder for you," Margaret said quietly, her voice more vulnerable than Sarah had ever heard it. I don't know how to make this work." "I know it's hard," Sarah said, meeting her gaze. "But it's important for Emily. She needs her whole family." We need to find a way to make this work, for her. Margaret nodded slowly, and for the first time, Sarah felt a small but significant shift. Maybe this wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where Emily could have both her parents and her grandparents in her life, without the walls of resentment and rejection. As Sarah and Emily left, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride. She had done what she had set out to do. She had stood up for herself, for her daughter, and she had forced David's family to see her not as an outsider, but as a mother who had every right to be part of her daughter's life. There was still a long way to go. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, and she knew that things wouldn't change overnight. But as she looked at Emily, her sweet face full of innocence and joy, Sarah knew that she was on the right path. She had taken the first step, and no matter what happened next, she would continue to fight for the life she and Emily deserved. The days after the family gathering were strangely quiet, and Sarah found herself reflecting on what had happened. The tension from the evening still lingered, but there was also something new. A glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was there. Margaret had shown a crack in her armor, and that small gesture had been enough to give Sarah something she hadn't felt in a long time: the possibility of healing. The next few weeks were a mix of uncertainty and quiet progress. After the family gathering, Sarah had stayed in touch with David, though their interactions were still tense and awkward. He still seemed unsure about what role he should play in bridging the gap between her and his family, but Sarah had no illusions. She couldn't wait for him to fix things. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about Emily, and Sarah was determined to make sure her daughter never had to choose between her parents. Emily, of course, was blissfully unaware of the complexities of the adult world. She asked about her grandparents often, especially. Margaret, and Sarah always did her best to answer honestly without overloading her daughter with the hurt that came with the fractured family. But it wasn't easy. Every time Emily asked why they didn't visit more often or why Grandma didn't come to see her, Sarah felt that familiar ache in her heart. Still, as the weeks passed, there was a slow but noticeable shift. David's family began to ease up just a little. They didn't invite Sarah back with open arms, not exactly, but they stopped treating her like a stranger. Every time she saw them, there was a little more warmth in their smiles. Margaret began to reach out more, asking how Emily was doing and even making small gestures that made Sarah feel like she was slowly being accepted back into their world. It was subtle, but Sarah could see it. She could feel it. The wall wasn't completely gone, but it was definitely coming down one small brick at a time. One evening, Sarah received an unexpected call from David. It was late, and she had just finished putting Emily to bed. When the phone rang, Sarah hesitated for a moment before answering. She still wasn't sure where things stood with David, but she had learned that there was no point in avoiding the conversation. If they were ever going to make any progress for Emily's sake, they would have to talk openly. "Hey, Sarah," David said, his voice sounding a little softer than usual. "I was thinking, maybe we could try again. I mean, not just for Emily's sake, but maybe we could find a way to get along, you know?" Sarah was surprised by his words. She had never expected him to reach out like this, especially not after everything that had happened. But there was something in his tone, a hint of vulnerability, that made her want to listen. "What do you mean, David?" Sarah asked carefully, trying not to get her hopes up. "We've both tried, but things are still tense and it's been hard. I don't know if we can just pretend everything's fine." David was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "I don't want us to pretend, Sarah. I just want Emily to be happy. I want us to be able to have family time without all the awkwardness. I know it's not going to be easy, but maybe it's time we both put aside the past for her, sake." His words were a turning point for Sarah. For the first time in a long time, she could hear the sincerity in his voice. She could tell that he was finally acknowledging the hurt, not just between them, but between her and his family as well. This wasn't a grand declaration of reconciliation, but it was a start. It was an invitation to try again, to build something new, something that wasn't based on resentment and old wounds. "Maybe we can try," Sarah said slowly. But it's going to take time, David. And it's going to take more than just saying the right words. Actions speak louder. David agreed, and with that they decided to take small steps. They agreed to meet for lunch the following weekend, just the three of them, Sarah, David, and Emily. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it felt like a step in the right direction. Sarah wasn't sure where this would lead, but for the first time in a while she felt like she was making progress. The lunch was simple but pleasant. Emily was the center of attention as usual, her infectious energy brightening up the table. Sarah and David still danced around each other, their conversations polite but cautious. But there was something different about this meeting. There was no arguing, no bitterness, just a shared focus on Emily. And for Sarah, that was enough to hold on to. Over the next few months, the relationship between Sarah and David's family continued to evolve. The awkwardness slowly faded away, and Sarah found herself invited to more family events. The invitations weren't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but they were no longer a constant presence. Margaret, who had once been so cold toward her, began to call more often, offering to help with Emily or just to chat. It was still a little uncomfortable at times, but Sarah could feel the genuine effort to rebuild the relationship. One evening, as Sarah was preparing dinner, Emily walked into the kitchen holding something small and wrapped in paper. "Mom, look, Grandma gave me this today," she exclaimed, her eyes wide with excitement. Sarah took the small package from Emily, her heart skipping a beat. She unwrapped it carefully and found a simple charm bracelet, something that seemed small but was clearly meant to be meaningful. A single charm dangled from it, shaped like a heart. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, her voice soft. She looked at Emily, her daughter's smile so bright it filled the room. "What did Grandma say?" Emily grinned. "She said it's for when I grow up and become a mom just like you," she said with a giggle. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes as she hugged Emily tightly. For so long, she had felt like a stranger, in David's family like she would never belong. But in that moment, with Emily in her arms, Sarah knew things were changing. Slowly, yes, but surely. That evening, as Sarah sat in the living room, she thought about how far she had come. It hadn't been easy and it wasn't perfect, but Sarah had done what she set out to do. She had fought for her daughter, for her place in Emily's life. And while there were still challenges ahead, she knew she was on the right path. Richard had been right all along. She didn't have to fight alone anymore. And as she looked at her daughter, her heart full of love, Sarah realized that despite everything, she had built something beautiful, something worth fighting for. As time passed, the relationship with David's family continued to improve. There were more moments of laughter, more shared memories, and more acceptance. It wasn't always perfect, but Sarah knew that it was real, and that was enough. Emily grew up surrounded by love, not just from Sarah, but from both sides of her family. And while it wasn't the perfect picture that Sarah had once imagined, it was better than she could have hoped for. It was a family, one that had been rebuilt piece by piece with patience, understanding, and a willingness to forgive. Sarah had learned that sometimes the greatest strength comes from knowing when to stand your ground and when to let go. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about creating the kind of life she wanted for herself and Emily, a life filled with love, growth, and the understanding that no matter the challenges, they could always move forward together.